One drink. 2 glasses. A clue left behind or something more sinister? Welcome to Twilight Clue. I am your host, Langford. This community keeps growing. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments make this mystery even better. Let's begin. It is strange recalling the hours before a case announces itself. They are filled with a kind of stillness one only notices afterward, as if silence itself had been waiting for its cue. I remember that morning clearly. The rain had spent most of the night testing the college roofs, and by dawn the quadrangle smelt of wet stone and fallen leaves. A porter passed me in the cloister, nodding in the manner of someone who had been trained never to ask questions. I had come early, for no particular reason, and found myself in the Bodleian, sitting at a long oak table where the varnish carried faint traces of ink from centuries of misuse. There were few others there. A scholar in a fraying tweed jacket was lost in a folio, lips moving faintly, as if the text were resisting him. Across the aisle, a student bent over her notes, tapping her pencil 3 times before writing each word, a ritual that seemed too precise to be mere habit. I tried not to watch her, but it is impossible for me not to notice such things. People give themselves away in the most unguarded gestures. I had opened a crossword in the Times, but made little headway. A clue asked for a poet lost in smoke, 7 letters. I toyed with Byron, with Keats, with others whose endings could be made to fit, but it was the word lost that lingered. It was not description, I thought, but instruction. Remove the letters of a name from another word. It struck me then that the answer must be Tennyson concealed in a synonym for fog. The solution eluded me still, but the method revealed itself, an approach I would later recognize in the case itself. The silence of the library was broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers and the distant groan of a cart on the cobbles outside. Time thickened. I remember the faint ache in my knee, the metallic taste of last night's whiskey, the way the student paused her ritual tapping when she sensed me glance in her direction. I returned to the crossword, ashamed of being caught. Leaving the library, I took the covered walkway toward Radcliffe Square. The air smelled of damp wool and cigarettes, though no one was smoking. Oxford often carries the residue of things no longer present. A conversation ended, a footstep vanished, the echo of bells when the tower stands mute. I paused under the dome of the Radcliffe camera and watched tourists scatter, umbrellas jerking like startled birds. It was then that Lewis found me. He said he had been looking, though I knew well enough he had only wandered the same paths and trusted chance to deliver me. His words were casual. "There's nothing yet, sir, only a call from St. John's, but I thought you'd want to know." I asked him what was meant by nothing yet, and he shrugged in that careful way of his. A woman had failed to appear for a tutorial, nothing more. It happened daily in the colleges, he said, though the tutor sounded a little unsettled. We walked together down Cat Street, the drizzle needling against our faces. I thought of the student in the library with her pencil ritual, of the crossword clue that hinted at concealment, of the word unsettled. Small things, perhaps, but small things are where truth waits. Lewis spoke of football fixtures, of a neighbour's dog that howled at odd hours, but my mind was elsewhere, circling that one absent figure who might already be beyond summoning. By the time we reached the Randolph for coffee, the rain had hardened into something steadier, and the street lamps glowed faintly, though it was not yet midday. The lobby smelt of polish and old smoke, the kind of smell that clings to memory long after it vanishes from fabric. We sat by the window, and I recall tracing the rim of my cup with a finger, as if drawing a circle around all that had not yet begun. Later, when the case declared itself with all its cruel intricacies, I would look back on that morning as the final moment of calm. Nothing had happened, and yet everything was already moving. The silence before the overture, the clue before the answer, the faint sense that somewhere, hidden within the stone and rain, the first step had already been taken. There are mornings in Oxford when the air itself seems to hesitate, reluctant to move forward into whatever is about to arrive. That particular day carried such a stillness, though it was broken soon enough by a voice half-whispered, almost embarrassed. In the porter's lodge at St. John's, a student gone, the man said, his eyes fixed not on me but on the ledger before him. Not missing, not absent, but gone. I recall the delicacy of his phrasing, as though the word death might crack the varnish on the desk. He was careful, deferential, And yet it was the hesitation in his tone that told me he knew more than he intended to share. Lewis had already heard. He met me in the quadrangle, his expression caught between concern and resignation. He said only that the college doctor had been summoned earlier, though the circumstances remained unclear. "A woman," he added quietly, as if that detail mattered more than it should. I nodded, though inside I felt the slight tug of recognition, the faint echo of what had unsettled me the day before. We walked across the grass, though it was not permitted, and entered through a narrow arch where the damp bricks exhaled a smell of moss and thyme. The corridor beyond was hushed, its floorboards complaining beneath our steps. A don passed us, head bowed, his gown brushing the stone like a mourner's sleeve. He muttered something about tragic inevitability, though I doubted he believed it. The room was small, lined with shelves that leaned under the weight of books no one had touched in years. On the desk a notebook lay open, its final page unfinished. I saw at once that the handwriting was neater at the beginning of each line, the letters loosening only at the end, as though fatigue had crept in by degrees. People rarely die in sudden gestures. It is often in the gradual slant of a pen where despair leaves its truest trace. Lewis asked if I thought it was suicide. His tone was cautious, deferential, the way he always offered me the simplest explanation first, waiting for me to complicate it. I told him nothing yet could be certain, though I noticed the way the window latch was worn bright, where someone had forced it open too often. I noticed, too, that the ashtray contained not one, but 3 brands of cigarette, each with a different length of filter. Students rarely smoke variety for pleasure. From the stairwell came the sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow. The tutor entered, an elderly man, stooped yet sharp-eyed, who regarded us with something between irritation and grief. He spoke of the young woman as talented, promising, though distracted of late. He said she had missed her appointment, yes, but it was not unusual for her. His voice trembled only once, when he admitted he had sent another student to knock on her door and found no reply. That kind of delegation, one life discovered by another, struck me as both cruel and inevitable in such places. I asked him whether she had friends. He said she had many acquaintances, but few confidants, a distinction that lingered in my mind long after. He mentioned a recent paper she had written, one filled with obscure references to poets long out of fashion, and that she had seemed preoccupied with puzzles of language. At this I thought again of the crossword clue in the library, the idea of concealment hidden within words, and felt the stir of something not yet formed. When we left the room, the afternoon rain had begun in earnest, a thin, relentless drizzle that blurred the spires and made the cobbles shine like slate. Lewis said nothing, which was unusual. I found myself grateful for the silence, for in silence details find their place. I recalled the 3 cigarette brands, the unfinished page, the tutor's reluctant candor. Small things, but already they pressed against one another, waiting to reveal a pattern. We paused beneath the archway, watching the students hurry across the square with scarves pulled tight and heads bowed. None of them glanced toward the windows of the room we had just left. Youth carries with it a strange indifference to mortality, a refusal to believe it might one day intrude upon their own timetable. I envied them, though I could not share their blindness. That evening, as I sat alone with a glass of whiskey and the crossword once again before me, the clue returned, a poet lost in smoke. The answer had finally arranged itself, Tennyson buried in the letters of tenon and mist, a construction term folded into vapor. I felt an odd chill at the thought. Words conceal, but they also betray. The same I knew would prove true of people. The death had been announced in passing, almost apologetically. But in Oxford, nothing remains passing for long. Beneath the rain, the story had already begun to thicken, and I found myself listening more closely than ever to the quiet between words. The first time I entered St. Athanasius, the gates gave the impression of a fortress rather than a place of learning. Blackened iron twisted into ornate patterns, too heavy for mere decoration, and as they closed behind me, I felt the subtle shift from the wide Oxford streets into something more contained, almost conspiratorial. Within those walls the air seemed older, more reluctant to circulate, as though it had been breathed too many times by men who seldom left. Lewis remarked that it was a strange place, though his tone suggested more curiosity than judgment. I told him most of the colleges are strange if one looks long enough. But St. Athanasius was stranger still. Its very name was seldom spoken in the same breath as the larger foundations. It held itself apart, protective of its obscurity. The fellows were few, their students fewer still, and I gathered that was how they preferred it. The porter who greeted us possessed a face of such impenetrable neutrality that one might have mistaken him for a figure carved into the stone. He spoke minimally, and when he did, his voice carried the rehearsed politeness of someone who had been trained to reveal nothing. Lewis asked about the woman's death. The man shifted his weight, looked beyond us toward the quadrangle, and said only that such matters were not for him to discuss. Yet I noticed his hands, large, reddened, flecked with ink stains, a porter with a scholar's fingers. The contradiction stayed with me. We crossed the quad. The grass was clipped with mathematical precision, bordered by paths that had been swept so recently that no leaf dared remain. The windows stared down at us in neat succession, shuttered against the drizzle. Lewis muttered that it felt like walking inside a chessboard. I said nothing, though I found the comparison apt. Inside, the corridors yielded little warmth. Paint peeled at the corners, and the light fixtures flickered with the indifference of age. A fellow met us halfway down the passage, tall, bespectacled, with a kind of fastidious neatness that seemed to extend to his very gait. He explained quietly, as if the walls themselves might overhear, that the college would prefer the matter handled discreetly. A tragedy, of course, but one must think of reputations, of prospective benefactors, of the delicate balance by which small institutions survive. His words were precise, but it was the way his eyes shifted toward the stairwell that told me more. He was less concerned with the dead than with the possibility of scandal climbing upward, step by step, into the public gaze. We were shown to the deceased's set of rooms, sparse though not bare, a desk crowded with papers, but carefully arranged, a shelf of books, each with the college's plate pasted inside the cover. Nothing struck me as unusual until I saw the timetable pinned above the desk. The days were neatly ruled, the hours blocked in pencil, but the Monday column carried two faint rubbings, as if an eraser had been pressed and lifted again. Whatever had been written there was gone, but the smudges remained, faint as bruises. Lewis asked if I noticed anything. I told him only that students rarely erase unless they fear someone else might read. It was not the absence of an appointment that mattered, but the insistence on its removal. A private meeting, perhaps, or something the student wished to keep from her tutor's eyes. The deduction was slight, fragile even, but enough to lodge in the mind. We left the rooms and made our way to the cloister. Rain traced the stone arches in thin rivulets. A bell tolled somewhere beyond the walls, its echo muffled as though even sound were reluctant to cross the boundary. Lewis observed that everyone here seemed to know more than they allowed. I agreed, though I added that secrecy is the very air such places breathe. Knowledge becomes less about truth than about possession. As we passed back through the gate, I glanced once more at the porter. His eyes followed us unreadable, though his hand still bore its faint blot of ink. A man who had been writing, perhaps, or copying something down when we interrupted him. A porter, yet not wholly a porter. The detail seemed minor, yet Oxford teaches one to distrust what seems minor. Outside, the city carried on as before, bicycles clattering across wet cobbles, umbrellas wrestling with the wind, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting faintly from Cornmarket. But within the closed world of St. Athanasius, time had slowed, folded in on itself, and I knew we had only brushed the surface of what it concealed. I have always believed that the smallest disturbances speak loudest, though only to those inclined to listen. That day, it was nothing more than a sheet of paper left where it ought not to have been. But I remember the moment, as if it were the hinge upon which the whole affair turned. Lewis and I returned to the students' rooms at St. Athanasius, the air still heavy with the faint scent of extinguished candles and the dampness that creeps through college walls in October. The curtains had been half drawn since our last visit, leaving a dimness that suited the room too well. On the desk, the same assortment of books lay, obedient in their alignment, but on the floor, just beneath the chair leg, a folded note had escaped attention. Lewis stooped to collect it. His eyes asked if he should open it, but I had already answered by watching too intently. He unfolded the page and handed it to me. It was a letter, though brief, written in a hand neither hurried nor relaxed. with each word placed carefully apart from the next, as if the writer mistrusted the connections. Only 2 sentences. The first offered an apology. The second referred to meeting again on Thursday, no place specified. There was no signature. Lewis thought it insignificant. Students wrote endless notes, most of them trivial, all of them disposable. But what struck me was not the content, so much as the absence of a crease where one would expect the paper to have been folded for delivery. It had been folded in 4, true, but clumsily, as if for concealment rather than for posting. Whoever left it did not intend it to travel far. The tutor, when questioned, claimed ignorance. His eyes widened at the very suggestion of clandestine meetings. Yet his denial came too swiftly, like a man rehearsing a part. I remembered the way he had described her paper on obscure poets, spoken with faint disapproval, perhaps even irritation. Scholars resent in their pupils the obsessions they themselves abandoned. We walked afterward through the cloisters, the rain beating steadily against the leaded panes. Lewis said the note proved nothing, and perhaps it did. He asked why Thursday should matter. I told him the day itself was of no importance, but the vagueness was. To agree upon a day without a place suggests the place was already understood between them. That, I said, was the first true whisper of intimacy we had uncovered. Later, in the dining hall, I sat at one of the long tables with the note folded once more in my pocket. The hall was nearly deserted. A few fellows lingered over coffee, their voices muted, their laughter brittle. I traced my fingers across the grooves carved into the wood, initials long since forgotten, and thought of how often meaning hides not in the words themselves, but in their omissions. A letter unsigned, a meeting unlocated, silence in its way more eloquent than confession. Lewis brought me tea, though he preferred beer, and lowered his voice. Do you think she meant to meet a lover? I considered the question. Perhaps, though, there was something too studied in the neatness of the script, too deliberate for passion. More likely she had been engaged in something requiring precision, something she felt must be hidden from the ordinary gaze. Secrets rarely belong to the heart alone. That night I returned to my rooms and spread the letter across the table. I set beside it the crossword I had left unfinished. A clue caught my eye again. Hidden meeting, no signature required, 8 letters. I stared at it for some minutes, amused and unsettled by the coincidence. The answer, when it came, was trysting, a word at once archaic and intimate, half concealed in its sound, a gathering known only to those who share it. I drank slowly, the whiskey leaving a warmth that faded too quickly. The note lay quiet yet insistent on the table, a fragment only, perhaps meaningless, and yet it did not feel like nothing. It felt like the faint overture of a design just beginning to emerge. When I think back now, it was not the body, nor the questions from the college, nor even the grief muffled behind academic courtesy that stayed with me most. It was that page out of place, folded and abandoned beneath a chair leg, a scrap of paper that should have been discarded, but instead remained waiting for the eyes that would see it. In Oxford, the smallest notes often carry the heaviest weight. I met her in the drawing room of a house that seemed built more for silence than for conversation. The curtains were heavy enough to smother daylight, though the afternoon sun pressed faintly against them, as if trying to intrude. She sat very straight in an armchair, her hands folded not in grief but in a poise that belonged to another century. There was no visible tremor in her fingers, no redness about the eyes, and I recall wondering whether she had rehearsed her composure, or whether it had been stitched into her long before the tragedy itself. Lewis spoke first, gently in the tone he reserved for mourners. He asked whether she had been informed of the circumstances. She nodded once, slowly, and said only that she had been told enough. The voice was low, precise, carrying neither anger nor surrender. I found myself studying the timbre of her vowels, the way each word seemed detached from the one that followed, as if language itself were something she allowed reluctantly. Her tea stood untouched at her side. I asked whether she wished us to leave her be. No, she said. I should prefer to speak now while everything is still close. The word close lingered with me, for it is not how most would describe the aftermath of death. It suggested proximity rather than loss, as though the departed remained only in the next room. Listening, Lewis asked the usual questions about friends, habits, moods, and she answered with an efficiency that bordered on the mechanical. There were names, a few anecdotes, the faintest recollections of late-night arguments about money. Yet nothing in her account bore the weight of confession. She was too calm, too exact, as though she had prepared a transcript. What struck me most was the room itself. On the mantelpiece, a row of photographs stood in ornate frames, though not one of them showed her husband alone. Always he was pictured in company, a shoulder turned toward him, a background of colleagues, an anonymous landscape, as if she had deliberately avoided memorializing him as an individual. I asked if there were other photographs, perhaps in albums. Her eyes narrowed, and she said softly that she had none to hand. It was not the refusal that unsettled me, but the phrasing, none to hand, as though the images did exist, but at a distance she intended to preserve. At one point her hand strayed to the small table beside her. I noticed a slip of paper beneath the teacup saucer, half hidden. She moved her hand away when she saw my gaze. A receipt, I thought, or perhaps a note left deliberately out of place. But I asked nothing. It is often better to let such details ripen until they fall of their own accord. Lewis later remarked that she had shown remarkable fortitude. I told him composure is rarely fortitude. More often it is strategy. He frowned, unpersuaded, but I could not escape the sense that her calm had been constructed brick by brick, like the walls of the house itself. A facade perhaps, but a flawless one. We left her with her silence. Outside, the garden was damp with the morning's rain, the gravel walk glistening faintly in the dim light. I paused to look back at the window where she still sat, motionless, her profile framed against the dark drapes. It was like watching a portrait rather than a woman. That night I opened the crossword again, my eyes caught by a clue I had overlooked. Self-restraint in widow's garb. 7 letters. I considered stoical, sedate, but it was only when I thought of facade that the letters aligned. A word that means front, appearance, a mask of stone over something unseen. It struck me then with the quiet force of inevitability. The answer was not in her words nor her gestures, but in the very perfection of her calm. And yet I did not know whether her composure concealed grief or guilt, or something subtler still. Only that it was too seamless to be untouched by design. I have learned to distrust the clarity of beginnings. More often than not, what first appears decisive later dissolves into error, and what we call progress proves nothing more than the wrong road taken confidently. That morning we believed we had found direction, and by evening I knew we had only wandered further into shadow. It began with a name. Lewis, ever diligent, had uncovered it in the margins of a college register. A man connected to the dead woman by the thinnest thread, an address penciled beside his own, a note of shared supervision. He thought it enough to warrant pursuit. I let him believe as much, for I too was tempted by the allure of something tangible. The man lived in Jericho, in one of those narrow terraces where the houses press against each other like silent conspirators. The front steps were worn hollow, the door painted an obstinate blue that peeled at the corners. He answered with an air of irritation, though he tried to disguise it as surprise. We introduced ourselves, and he invited us in with a courtesy that arrived a fraction too late. His rooms were neat, almost ascetic. Our desk cleared of everything save for an ashtray, the kind hotels distribute cheaply, and a small pile of lecture notes arranged with military care. He said he had known the woman only slightly, that her intellect had impressed him, though she was, in his words, easily distracted. When pressed, he admitted to seeing her the week before, a chance meeting near the river. He claimed nothing more. Lewis believed him. I could see it in the way he settled back, shoulders loosening, notebook closing. But there was something in the man's gaze, a fraction too steady, as if rehearsed. His sentences came with no hesitation, and yet each one seemed cut from the same cloth, brief, polished, inconsequential. People who tell the truth rarely manage such symmetry. On the mantelpiece, a small clock ticked loudly. I asked him the time, though I carried my own watch. He answered without looking, and when I checked against my own dial, I found the hands of his clock lagged by 8 minutes. An untidy detail in a room that tolerated no disorder. When I pointed this out lightly, he smiled in a manner too precise, saying he rather liked the clock that way, but I wondered if he had relied upon it for alibis not quite as watertight as his voice implied. We left him after an hour, Lewis still half persuaded of his innocence. As we stepped back into the narrow street, he said perhaps we were chasing shadows. I reminded him that shadows sometimes reveal the outline of what stands in their way. He looked unconvinced. In the afternoon we walked to the river, the drizzle misting over the water until the boats blurred into pale sketches. I tried to imagine the chance meeting described, but no configuration of the path seemed to fit. Students did not frequent that stretch in October. The ground was too sodden, the air too raw, and why had she walked there alone if indeed she had? The false note in his story grew louder the more I listened to it. Back at the station, the day's optimism ebbed away. Reports arrived, none conclusive. One suggested she had been seen in Cornmarket on the same afternoon. Another swore she had entered a tobacconist's shop, though no purchase could be traced. Each account contradicted the last, leaving us no nearer than before. That evening, weary of half-truths, I turned to the crossword again. Our clue read, misleading path taken with confidence, 9 letters. For once the answer came at once, red herring. I felt the faintest smile tug at me, for the word itself mocked the day entire. A trail we had followed with too much eagerness, leading us not to discovery but to its opposite. Lewis, over a pint, suggested we might at least have eliminated one suspect. I said perhaps, though elimination is often the most dangerous illusion of all, to strike through a name too early is to risk erasing the very truth one seeks. He looked at me curiously, then sipped his beer, unwilling to argue. When I walked home through the darkened streets, the rain had deepened into something steadier, and Oxford lay blurred beneath it. The spires loomed like half-remembered promises, their edges smudged by mist. I carried the sense of failure quietly, knowing it would not be the last. The first false trail is never the final one. Yet it lingers, a reminder that truth does not come obediently when called. It prefers to hide, to delay, to test the patience of those who pursue it. And so the case remained, suspended between fact and fabrication, with nothing yet resolved. Only the echo of footsteps in Jericho and the faint ticking of a clock that ran 8 minutes behind. It was in a draughty college chamber, the sort of place where dust seems to have made a pact never to leave, that I first heard his account. He was not a young man, though his face bore the pallor of someone who had spent too long in the company of verses rather than people. His hair hung too long at the nape, his tie loose, his hands stained faintly with ink, as though he had carried his words in his body rather than upon the page. Lewis had found him reluctant to meet us. Poets are often reluctant. They mistrust prose, mistrust the flatness of ordinary speech. Yet eventually he agreed, and so I sat opposite him as the late light filtered through a narrow window, illuminating only the dust motes. Never his eyes. Never his eyes. He began without prompting. She had been bright, he said, too bright perhaps, like a flame in a room of shadows. He spoke of long evenings discussing texts, of her habit of underlining half a stanza and ignoring the rest, of her impatience with structure. He smiled faintly when he recalled her laughter, though the smile belonged more to memory than to affection. Lewis asked him directly whether there had been intimacy. The poet looked down at his hands, spreading his fingers as though to examine the ink stains, and said nothing for a long moment. At last he whispered that words can be more dangerous than touches. A confession of sorts, though one that offered no evidence. What held me, though, was the way he handled a small notebook on the desk beside him. He touched it repeatedly, as though testing its reality, but never opened it. I asked if it belonged to her. He shook his head, then hesitated, then said softly it contained his own work, some of which she had read. His eyes flicked to mine, a glance too swift to be casual. I wondered then if the notebook held more than poems. He poured himself a glass of sherry and left it untouched. His words shifted, grew denser, fragments of verse spliced with recollection. He muttered of betrayal, though he did not name the betrayer. He murmured that she had secrets, but so did everyone, and that the cruelest secrets were often the simplest ones. He grew agitated when Lewis asked again where he had been on the night she died. He claimed to have been in his rooms writing, the notebook his alibi. But when I asked him to recite a line from what he had written, he faltered, stammered, then offered a couplet so trite I knew it had been assembled on the spot. There, I thought, was the confession, not in the words themselves, but in their failure. A poet who could not remember his own lines was either lying or drowning in guilt too dense to navigate. When we left, Lewis said he had never understood poets. I told him they are much like detectives, forever trying to stitch fragments into coherence, though less willing to accept when the seams will not hold. He said he thought the man unstable, perhaps dangerous. I agreed, though with the caveat that instability is not the same as culpability. That night alone, I opened the day's crossword. A clue stared back at me. Unreliable memory, source of false testimony, 7 letters. I tried amnesia, lapse, but neither fit. At last the answer formed: erasure. I set down the paper and thought of the poet's notebook, the missing lines, the faltering voice. Not the absence of memory, but its deliberate scouring. And yet even in his stumbling, even in his evasions, I could not decide whether he confessed to guilt or merely to sorrow. The two are often so alike, one must listen not for what is said, but for the silence stitched between the syllables. The poet's confession, if that is what it was, left me no clearer. Only a little colder. It was Lewis who found the diary. He had the luck of the straightforward man, the kind who notices what ought not to be there because he does not expect tricks. It lay half concealed at the back of a drawer, beneath a layer of lecture notes. A slim book, bound in green leather, the corners worn smooth from handling. But what struck us both at once were the pages, many intact, but a section near the middle had been torn, not neatly, but in anger. The ragged edges like wounds. We set it upon the desk in the dim light of the students' rooms, the rain outside rhythmically pressing against the windows. Lewis asked whether I thought it significant. I said significance is a dangerous word. Sometimes a torn page is only frustration. But I traced the edges with my finger, and the absence of words seemed to me louder than any that might have remained. There were entries still legible, snatches of daily routine, fragments of moods. Nothing remarkable. Yet one sentence caught my attention. Thursday not here. We'll explain later. The words had been underlined, though lightly, as if in indecision. Thursday again, the day that returned like a refrain in this investigation. We carried the diary back to the station, where another document awaited us, a will, recently altered. Lewis handed it to me with that careful look he reserves for moments he knows I will dislike. The student's name appeared in it, not as beneficiary but as witness. Witness to a change that transferred a modest fortune from one fellow of St. Athanasius to another, only weeks before her death. Lewis asked if I thought it coincidence. I said I have little faith in coincidence. He pressed, then why witness a will? I told him perhaps because she was there, and they trusted her to keep silence, or perhaps because she was never meant to understand the weight of what she signed. The diary and the will sat side by side on my desk like quarreling siblings. One full of absences, the other of presences too deliberate. Torn pages, altered words, both carrying the sense of hands that wished to shape the truth to their liking. That evening I found myself in the Randolph, the crossword open before me. The clue, change of testament, concealed motive, 8 letters. The answer, of course, was codicil. Yet the word brought with it more than its definition. Hidden in it was the echo of codex, a book, a diary. One altered by law, the other torn by hand. Different documents, but both instruments of concealment. When we visited the fellow whose fortune had grown by amendment, he greeted us with an ease too polished, like a man who has practiced courtesy to avoid suspicion. He insisted the alteration was trivial, a matter of housekeeping. He said the student had merely been present, that she had asked no questions. But I noticed the faintest pause when Lewis asked the date. His eyes lifted not toward us, but toward a calendar on the far wall as though to borrow certainty. A man secure in truth does not require prompting from paper. Walking back through the rain, Lewis remarked that it all seemed tenuous. I agreed, and yet tenuous threads, when gathered, sometimes form a net strong enough to catch what matters. The diary torn, the will altered, each on its own might be dismissed. Together they hummed faintly with implication, like wires strung between unseen posts. That night I could not sleep. I thought of the student's neat hand in the diary, abruptly silenced by tearing. I thought of her signature on the will, a name written without knowing what it might come to bind her to. And I thought of Thursday, the day that hovered at the edge of each document, like a shadow cast before the figure itself has stepped into view. No answers then. Only the sense that in the tearing of pages and the altering of words, the dead had left us their quietest testimony. A confession not in what was written, but in what had been destroyed. It is the danger of cases such as these that the mind, desperate for order, will seize too early upon what appears a conclusion. We had already been led once into error, and yet when the second arrangement of facts presented itself, so neat in its shape, I confess I felt the faint stir of relief. How easily we mistake symmetry for truth. It was Lewis who first voiced the theory. The altered will, the diary torn, the poet's evasions, all of it could, he suggested, point toward a simple narrative. The young woman, drawn into confidences too heavy for her, had attempted blackmail. The fellow at St. Athanasius, fearful of exposure, had silenced her. It explained the documents, the secrecy, even the unfinished page upon her desk. I remember listening to him in the station, his voice carrying that rare conviction he seldom allowed himself. He was almost eager, though he tried to hide it beneath a policeman's gravity. I did not contradict him at once. Instead, I poured another cup of tea, though it had grown tepid, and stared at the rain sliding down the window. A pattern of droplets formed for a moment like a constellation, then broke apart. We pursued the idea. The fellow was summoned again, and again he denied, though this time with less composure. He called the accusation grotesque. He said the student had been a mere witness, nothing more, and yet in his denial lay something rehearsed, as though he had already imagined the line of suspicion and prepared his outrage accordingly. Lewis left the room convinced. I left unsettled, for what struck me most was not what the man said, but what he avoided. He spoke freely of money, of reputation, of benefactors. Yet when I asked about Thursday, he faltered. He said he could not recall what business had detained him, though surely such a day must have been crowded with college duties. Memory fails all of us, but rarely in so convenient a place. We carried our conclusions back to the college. The master received us in his panelled office, where the smell of leather and pipe smoke lingered in the heavy air. He listened with a calm that bordered on indifference. At last he said, "The fellow you accuse is vain, certainly, but hardly capable of murder." "Vanity and murder," I replied, "are not so far apart as one imagines." He smiled faintly, as if at a remark too theatrical to take seriously. That evening, restless, I returned alone to the Bodleian. The corridors were nearly deserted, the lamps casting long shadows across the polished floors. I sat at a desk in the corner, spread the crossword before me, and found my eyes drawn to a clue I had overlooked. Convincing but incorrect answer, 7 letters. The solution came at once, decoy, and in that moment the shape of our supposed resolution began to unravel. A decoy is not merely wrong, it is wrong with purpose. It lures the hunter deliberately astray. Was this not what had happened? Had we not been drawn to the obvious arrangement of facts, their neatness, their cruel symmetry, only to discover the neatness itself was the trap? Lewis, when I told him, sighed heavily. He said we could not keep discarding solutions whenever they failed to please me. I told him truth does not please. It unsettles. He said perhaps we were chasing shadows again. I reminded him that shadows require substance to cast them. He muttered that one day I would find shadows enough to drown us both. The second false solution had at least taught me this. We were dealing not with accident, but with design. Someone had arranged the facts with care, knowing how easily men like Lewis and myself would be seduced by the promise of order. To tear a diary, to alter a will, to falter in a memory. Each gesture was too perfectly weighted to point in one direction. Someone wanted us to believe. That night, in the silence of my rooms, I poured a measure of whiskey and listened to the rain. Oxford lay hushed, the spires blurred in the darkness, the cobbles shining faintly under gaslight. I thought of the dead woman, of her absent Thursdays, of the torn pages that refused to speak. And I thought of the hands, clever, patient hands, that had arranged this second false trail with such deceptive elegance. The case was no nearer to its ending. Only the certainty that we had once again mistaken the surface for the depth, the reflection for the thing itself. And so I closed the crossword, unfinished, and let the silence carry me into a night that promised no answers, only further riddles. Memory alters with time. What seemed insignificant becomes insistent. What once glowed with certainty dims into doubt. It was late one evening, after another day spent circling the same barren ground, that I found myself drawn back to the crossword. A puzzle begun weeks before, folded and refolded, until the creases obscured half the print. I had abandoned it at the time, convinced the answers were beyond me. But as I spread it across the desk once more, the faded ink seemed to speak differently. as though the words themselves had altered while lying silent in the drawer. Lewis had gone home, weary of my silences. He had said, "It's just a crossword, sir. You're chasing ghosts." And I had nodded, though I knew better. Crosswords are maps of the mind, small architectures of deceit and disclosure. To solve them requires a kind of double vision, the ability to read both what is present and what is hidden beneath. The same, I thought, as this case. The clue that drew me back was one I had circled idly before. Absent day concealed in ordinary phrase, 9 letters. I had tried variations, Thursday, omission, emptiness, but none fit. Only now did the word absence itself shift into focus, its letters rearranging into substance. Substance. Something present, not gone. I realized with a cold clarity that I had misread the very grammar of the clue. It was not absence at all. It was presence camouflaged, and with that the case itself stirred anew. I thought of the student's diary, the pages torn away. I had assumed they were removed to erase something. But what if they were taken not to destroy but to preserve, to carry elsewhere, to keep hidden in another place? I thought of the widow's composure, her hands folded too perfectly, and how I had mistaken her calm for erasure of feeling, when in truth it had been the sheltering of it. We had been trained to look for what was missing, yet what remained intact and too tidy might be the louder clue. The rain was steady outside, blurring the lamps across the square. I sat listening to it, tasting the stale whiskey at the bottom of my glass. In the quiet, details once dismissed returned with unwelcome insistence. The porter's ink-stained hands, the poet's faltering memory of his own lines, the clock that ran 8 minutes slow. Each one, I realized, had been reread before, but perhaps never truly seen. Lewis would tell me in the morning that I was imagining patterns, weaving threads where none were meant to meet. But I knew better. A crossword setter never places words carelessly. Each answer is planted with intent. The same must be true of the details scattered across this case. Their very untidiness formed a symmetry too delicate to ignore. I took the pencil and filled in the squares, S-U-B-S-T-A-N-C-E. The letters locked neatly into place, their certainty both mocking and consoling. The clue had always been about concealment, but not by absence. By presence too obvious to notice. A diary still on the desk, when it might better have been burnt. A will altered, yet witnessed openly. A note folded clumsily, left visible. All of them substance masquerading as void. When I looked up, the clock on my mantelpiece marked the hour with its soft chime. I felt the city pressing around me, the libraries dark, the corridors empty, the stones wet under the endless drizzle. Oxford, like the crossword, had been speaking all along in double meanings. We had simply been reading too shallowly. I did not yet know where this rereading would lead. Only that it marked a turning, a subtle realignment of perspective. The case was not built upon what had been torn away, but on what had been left behind for us to misinterpret. And so I sat in the quiet, the crossword finished at last, the whiskey glass empty, the rain tapping gently at the window. The silence seemed less like failure than before, more like the pause between clue and answer. The moment when meaning hovers, not yet fully spoken but no longer hidden. She entered the investigation not as a suspect, nor a witness, but as a presence. Some figures drift through a case like whispers in a corridor. Others linger, demanding attention without ever asking for it. She was the latter. I remember her first appearance clearly. A winter light slanting across the college quadrangle, her dark coat gathered close, her step measured yet unhurried. The porter greeted her with a stiffness reserved for those he knew but did not entirely approve of. Lewis asked me later who she was. I told him I had only a name from the register, a visiting scholar of some sort, recently attached to St. Athanasius. He shrugged, unconvinced, but I had already noticed too much. The way she moved as though she carried secrets stitched into her very posture, the careful distance she maintained from everyone she encountered. When we spoke, her manner was courteous, but it was the courtesy of someone who grants a conversation rather than shares in it. She said she had known the dead student only in passing, that their paths had crossed in the library once or twice. She said she could not recall any detail of their conversations, though her pause before answering told me she recalled plenty. She asked whether the police always lingered so long over cases of youthful despair. I told her we lingered only where despair proved less than simple, less than simple. Lewis, ever straightforward, remarked afterwards that she was cold. I said she was not cold. She was distant. Coldness implies absence of feeling, but distance requires it. Else why take such trouble to guard it? He looked at me curiously but said no more. It was later that same evening at the Randolph that I returned to the crossword. The clue read, "She who cannot be grasped, 9 letters. Elusive I tried, then ethereal, neither fit." That last unattainable slotted perfectly into place, and I felt the faintest smile, for the word itself seemed to have followed me from the quadrangle to the page. Coincidence, perhaps, but Oxford has always thrived on such echoes. In the days that followed, she appeared at odd angles to the case. A sighting in the college garden at dusk, a glimpse through the library window, her head bent over a folio. Each time she vanished before we could approach. I told Lewis that avoidance is as revealing as presence, but he replied she was simply occupied with her own work. He did not see the rhythm in her comings and goings, the way they brushed so closely against the movements of the dead woman. Too close to ignore, too fleeting to prove. When at last I confronted her again, she did not flinch. She admitted she had spoken more than once with the student, that the young woman had confided some anxieties about her tutor, but then she stopped as though the words had betrayed her, and she retreated behind silence. I pressed gently, but her eyes told me what her voice refused. She knew more than she would allow herself to say. That night I walked home through Broad Street, the rain scattering the light of the lamps across the wet cobbles. I thought of her face, the faintest tremor when I mentioned the diary, the sharpness of her refusal when I asked about the will. I thought of how some people seem built to remain just out of reach, their lives drawn in lines the rest of us cannot cross. She was not guilty, I told myself, at least not in the ordinary sense. Yet she was bound to the case in ways I could not untangle. Like a word that fits the crossword grid too perfectly and yet refuses to satisfy the clue, the unattainable woman. There have been several in my life, though none left me nearer to clarity than to longing. And in this case she stood as both witness and riddle, reminding me yet again that the heart often obscures truth more effectively than the lie ever can. It was a small thing, almost insultingly small, and yet it stayed with me longer than the arguments, the alibis, even the grief. In the students' room, amidst the clutter of books and papers, amidst the traces of a life paused mid-sentence, there had been 2 glasses on the table. One held the faint rim of lipstick, half a measure of sherry congealed to syrup. The other stood untouched, clear and accusing. Lewis noticed the first. I noticed the second. When I asked him later what he thought, he said perhaps she had intended company and none had arrived. I told him people do not pour drinks for companions who never come. They pour because someone is already present, already expected. He frowned, muttering that sometimes a glass is only a glass, but the untouched one had been placed opposite her chair, set with such symmetry that it could not have been accident. I thought of her hand, steady as she folded notes, deliberate in every movement. She would not have set out a second glass unless she had reason, and if that person failed to drink, was it by choice or by haste? We returned to the college the next day, the drizzle hanging like gauze across the quad. The tutor met us in the passage, his gown swaying faintly, his face calm to the point of irritation. He asked whether we were any nearer to resolution. I told him nearer, perhaps, but resolution is a treacherous word. He said the fellows were growing impatient. I said the dead are more patient still. He did not smile. In the room once more I traced the outline of the glasses with my finger. The one half filled had been shifted slightly, as though lifted and replaced more than once. The other sat precisely where it had first been set, not an inch disturbed. I told Lewis to look closer. He bent reluctantly, then admitted he saw no ring of moisture, no trace of lips. I said exactly so. He asked if that proved anything. I said proof is rarely so obliging. What matters is suggestion. That evening I turned again to the crossword. The clue, companions drink untouched. Sign of absence, 10 letters. I stared at it long, the answer elusive. Eventually it came, abstention. Yet the word carried more than its dictionary weight. Abstention is not mere refusal. It is a decision to withhold, to deny participation. The empty glass was not accident. It was refusal made visible. The next morning I asked the widow whether her husband had ever taken sherry. She looked at me too steadily before answering. Occasionally, she said, but only when pressed. I thought of the untouched glass and wondered if it had been poured for him or for someone else entirely. Lewis speculated the poet might have been there, that he had been offered the drink and declined. I said perhaps. But the poet had spoken of evenings by the river, of words shared in quiet. He would have taken the glass if only to prolong the moment. Declining would have broken the intimacy he so carefully implied. No, I told him, the untouched glass belonged to someone who wanted distance, not closeness. Someone who had sat opposite her and chosen silence over drink. That night I walked alone past the Radcliffe camera, its dome glistening under the rain. The streets were nearly deserted, save for a cyclist gliding like a shadow. I thought of the two glasses again, the symmetry of their placement, the stark contrast of one used and one forsaken. Objects tell their truths quietly. People cloak them in words. Lewis, when I told him, shook his head. He said we had too little to go on, that a glass could mean anything or nothing. I told him meaning hides in such nothings. He sighed, muttered that I saw too much. Perhaps I do. But I could not shake the conviction that the empty glass was the truest witness we had. Looking back now, it seems to me the entire case could be distilled into that tableau. Two glasses, one left behind. Presence and absence side by side, the tension between what was shared and what was withheld. In that quiet refusal lay the shape of the truth, though it would take me many nights and many more false answers before I began to see it clearly.